Welcome to the Passive House podcast, brought to you by Passive House Accelerator, a catalyst for zero carbon building. For news, inspiration, and connections from all flavours of Passive House, check out passivehouseaccelerator.com. Sign up to receive regular updates about events, get your questions answered, and contribute to the community dialogue. There's loads of free information for experienced professionals and people just starting out on their Passive House journey. We hope to see you at one of our weekly Passive House Accelerator live webinars. In the meantime, here's this week's Passive House podcast. Welcome back to the Passive House podcast. I'm Matthew Cutler-Welsh, coming to you from Auckland in New Zealand.
And I'm Zack Semke, coming to you from Seattle, Washington.
How you doing, Zack?
The cherry blossoms are out in Seattle, and we hit 60 degrees Fahrenheit a couple days in a row as a high, so it is feeling good. How about you?
That sounds warm. Well, we're starting to cool down, getting a bit of condensation on the windows. Normally things, I like to not turn the heat pump on before around Anzac Day, but that's still a month away, and I have been tempted to put the heater on this week. I did clean out the filter of my my heat pump yesterday, so it's ready to go, and I feel like we'll be needing it soon. My daughter is down in the South Island at the moment, and it was single digits down there. They got down to close to zero in the middle of the South Islands. They had some pretty cool, clear nights. So, yeah, we kind of missed out on summer this year. We had a bit of a shocker. So, here's hoping for a bit of snow, maybe a bit of nice, a nice, decent winter would be kind of nice.
Yeah. So when you say you missed out on summer because of the crazy rain or
floods, cyclones, yeah. Ironically, it was actually quite warm in the South Island. They had a few nice weeks down there. So it was just a bit odd this year.
Yeah.
Anyway, we've got some great stuff to get through today. Fantastic interview with a repeat guest of this show and also of the Accelerator in general. But before we get into that, let's do a quick shout out to our sponsors.
Absolutely. So a big thank you to our founding sponsors, 475 High Performance Building Supply, Baxt Ingwe Architects, Glavel Foam Glass Gravel, Minitair all-in-one HVAC and dehumidification units, Mitsubishi Electric Train HVAC US, Partel, Rockwool North America, Stocorp, and Zola Windows. Thanks also to our champion sponsors, Icon Windows and Doors, Intelligent Membranes, Proseco, and Source 2050. And a big thank you to our stakeholder partner, NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority.
Very good. Now, Mark Siddall is he'd been no stranger to most people, I think, in our audience. He's been in the Passive House scene in the UK for a long time as an early adopter, but not just that. He has also been quite prolific in the quality and quantity of stuff that he's produced and has made available to the community. So really cool stuff. He's been on this podcast back at episode 52, also episode 107, talking about getting quite deep into things like thermal bypass in that most recent interview. He's been in a couple of videos as well, Zack.
Yeah, he presented on the Global Passive House Showcase back in 2021, October 20th, 2021, and we'll include a link to the video of his presentation. He presented about his project, the Larch Corner Passive House, which was the winner of the 2021 UK Passive House Award for Small Projects. Really cool project. So we'll, again, share that in show notes.
So what was the purpose for getting Mark back on the show for a third time?
Yeah, so Mark, as you alluded to, is very prolific as a technical thinker and is passionate about sharing technical knowledge, right? And a really key piece of passive house practice is to figure out how to overlay the principles of passive house design and the key moves that you need to make in passive house design, overlay that onto standard architectural practice, like the stages of architectural practice. And so he prepared, working with Passive House Trust and RIBA, which is the Association of Architects in the UK, prepared what is called the RIBA Passive House Overlay, and recently published that. And so we had a chance to connect and have Mark kind of step through what the inspiration for that overlay, the imperative to bring Passive House into architectural practice, given our 2030 goals, and specifically there are some RIBA 2030 goals that Passive House will help achieve. And then he talked in some detail about this report and the kind of specific guidance that it provides architects who want to bring Passive House into their work. And another thing that was cool about the conversation is that Mark was doing some translation work for us between the stages of design in the UK and the stages of design in the US. And so that I think he was calling that kind of like the Rosetta Stone a little bit.
UK-US bilingual. It's very impressive.
Yeah, exactly.
I thought he was going to attempt to convert energy units there for a moment, but pulled back.
No, right. Maybe that'll be for the next interview. So it was a great conversation, and let's dive in. So I'm joined by Mark Siddall of LEAP, the lovingly engineered architectural process firm that he heads up in the UK. It's really great to have you back, Mark.
Yeah, it's great to be back. It doesn't seem like it was 5 minutes.
I know, right? So, I mean, Mark, you always bring such interesting work to the table here in these conversations. And I think the most recent one that we had was on your thermal bypass study that you produced with the Passive House Trust. And here we are back with another piece of a body of work that you're involved with Passive House Trust and the RIBA, which is the equivalent of the AIA in the UK, called the RIBA Passive House Overlay. And really interesting insights here. And I think what you're going to do is if I understand correctly, is to share what some of the findings and key points that you have outlined in this overlay, and then also relate it a little bit to practice in the U.S. To some degree. So let's dive in. I mean, first, what's the RIBA plan of work? What does that mean? What is that?
Yeah. So the plan of work is basically the process that we tend to follow, one way or another, when we're designing a building. So I understand that over in the States, you've got basically 5 stages that are commonly used: schematic design, design development, contract documents, bidding, and contract administration. Well, the plan of work basically lays out that process for us. It's a little bit broader, should we say. We actually have 8 stages, that, should we say, top and tail some of that process that's the AIA uses. And we can talk about that in a bit more detail, so we can listeners can convert between the English and the American kind of processes there. But so that basically takes you from a blank sheet of paper all the way through to being inside the building. Right. That's what the RIBA plan of work does, and it kind of addresses certain key procedural elements that we need to consider that track all the way through a project. And so that leads us naturally on to thinking about the overlay, and the overlay is basically just taking a twist, shall we say, just adding on the Passive House. What does Passive House introduce and add to that conversation that would otherwise normally go on? So it's streamlining Passive House into everyday practice. And it's doing a lot to demystify what the processes are and helping building upon the experience of passive house designers in the UK, working on smaller residential projects all the way up to those huge projects, schools, archive buildings, offices, whatever. So bringing all that experience and then putting it into this overlay so that it distills down a whole body of knowledge to set out how people can design and build low energy buildings, passive house buildings, successfully. And during that process, we undertook some interviews, questionnaires that helped to formulate an understanding of what it is that we, as passive house designers, do differently to the rest, which are kind of standard design practices. And because we had one of my little hats that I wear, I am co-chair of the RIBA Northeast Sustainable Futures Forum. That's a mouthful. We had one event about the overlay in its early days, and we had the opportunity to speak to passive house designers and non-passive house designers, architects, engineers, whoever turned up, and we got a feel for the differences between those two groups, should we say.
Right. And I think that you go into some detail in this piece about in that overlay, and maybe sort of lay out a little bit of a system for design at these different stages. And so I think that we can, in the U.S., take each of those kind of bullet points and insights and map them onto our SD, CD, DD, CA stages. So I think there's a lot of relevance. Another important piece of this is the RIBA 2030 challenge. Can you say a bit about that?
Yeah. So we've got the standard process that the whole industry uses, which is the plan of work. But then more recently, the RIBA developed the 2030 challenge, which kind of broadly, should we say, is similar to your 2030 challenge over in the States. Mm-hmm. Now, basically, this sets out a bit of a step code, should we say, to use the Canadian parlance, right. About how you could, there's certain stages. By 2020, we should be doing one thing, 2025, another, 2030, we should be kind of really have knuckled down. The RIBA 2030 challenge basically, and very usefully, sets metrics. And it does so not by percentage-based improvements, which we know kind of lead to erroneous thinking. It uses kilowatt hours per meter square per annum, or you'd probably convert it into your BTUs per square foot. Yeah. So the RIBA have set that out as a benchmark targets for energy performance of buildings, for domestic buildings, non-domestic buildings, and the likes. Now, they just give an overarching heading, should we say? They haven't drilled down to space heating demand or some of the other subtleties that we deal with in passive house design. So they've given an overarching heading. But what's interesting is it's not a design standard. It's an as-built performance standard.
Right.
So this is the one whereby there's a lot riding on that. You've got to have nailed it. You've got to be confident that your design processes are going to deliver the expectation.
Yeah.
And that's where passive house really comes to the fore, because there's so much evidence now that shows passive house buildings of whatever scale they are just work. The performance gaps get closed. The statistically kind of useful group, we know that everything works. So we've got that level of confidence. So the passive house is welcomed, should we say, by the RIBA because of this alignment. And then, so the 2030 challenge is basically coming off the back of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And that's then been kind of refined down into kind of distilled into a smaller group of things. And then passive house obviously speaks to some of these issues. The plan of the 2030 challenge also talks about embodied carbon and sets targets for that, which is great and obviously aligns very well with passive house. And within the passive house overlay, I've included a diagram which I call the cone of carbon. Because if the little graphic is, if you turned it on its side, if you turned the code on its side, it looks a bit like a funnel or whatever. So that walks us through some of the decision making and shows alignment between good passive house practices in terms of getting the form factor right and those things, and also reducing embodied carbon and choosing the right materials. So there's a lot of parallels that can tie in, and we've mapped that out through all of the RIBA stages, which we can recap and I'll set some context about, so that our listeners on both sides of the pond can see how these stages relate to one another. So what that means is that basically the RIBA plan of work is numbered. It used to be letters, but it's now numbers. It has been for a good few years. And what we have is we've got a pre-design phase, which I don't really see kind of fully itemized and clarified in the AIA methodology.
Right. I think practitioners very commonly include a pre-design phase in when they describe their work. But
okay.
right, it's not.
Yeah. So pre-design, we would call that strategic definition and also preparation and briefing. So it's broken down into two parts. Strategic definition is often something that's happening more on the client side. It doesn't really involve an architect necessarily, but the client's making some very big important decisions. They're thinking about budgets and they're trying to find sites, stuff that people can usefully contribute towards and help hone and refine. So it's very wise for a client to start to engage with some preliminary discussions. Maybe it's not the final appointment, but they should be getting some feedback from industry to help tune their understanding to make sure that they're approaching the project in the right kind of way. And that's one of the key times where a passive house designer can obviously start to contribute, because understanding the metrics, introducing them to passive house, explaining what it is and how the benefits of it and how it can help them, and how it'll give them what they're trying to achieve. What they want, maybe low energy bills. They want a comfortable work environment or home environment. They want good indoor air quality. They want better productivity. They want to reduce fuel poverty. Whatever it may be, passive house can help in those regards. So a bit of education, a bit of support can help in those kind of pre-design stages. And that also feeds into the brief, where with support from a passive house designer, you can start to deal with, kind of evolve the right metrics that can help channel the design in the right way. Because obviously a passive house designer may be the architect, for argument's sake, but they may not be as well. They could be an independent passive house designer coming in and complementing a design team. So it's important that passive house designer is able to help focus attention on key things, like, for example, form factor. We know that's important. Now, different scales of building work well with different form factors and become more cost effective. So we can start to tune that, and we can also start to engage in conversations about how to get the best value out of the design and have those challenging conversations, constructive, challenging conversations at the right stage before you've gone too far, before the design is fully meshed in and people have started to make commitments to it. Before you've even put a pen on paper, you can be testing some rough, broad parameters. So that's where that's useful. And then you can start to get into developing a concept design. So it's almost kind of like pre-concept design, noodling around, should we say. And then so concept design for us is what I guess you'd call schematic design. And then we get into that's what we call RIBA stage 2. The stage 3 is spatial coordination, which roughly speaks to me as though it's an AIA design development sort of phase.
Yeah, probably some schematic design too. Yep.
Yeah. And then we've got the technical phase, which is stage 4. So we've got spatial coordination stage 3 as well. So I think you bind in that into design development as well. Stage 4 is technical for us, and that's a bit more your contract documents, because obviously this is all the firming things up and making things, getting it ready for going out to go to tender or whatever else. Or you might, depending on the procurement mechanism, you might be working with a contractor and refining the design with them already, if it's a design and build, for argument's sake. And then you have bidding, we have contract administration. You've got you've got bidding and contract administration. We have manufacturing and construction. So that's the one whereby the bidding and contract administration were a part of that construction process. They overlap with one another, or they're aligned with one another. And then we also then have after we have a stage 6, which is actually a handover. So this is the handover process, and how is that managed? Right. So that way the client can be educated about the building, or the users can be educated about the building and how to get the most out of it. And then we've got the in-use phase, and that's when we get to do post-occupancy evaluation and find out what really happens. Are the people inside the building happy? Is the energy, how much energy is really being used? Is it, is the thermal comfort right? What are the temperatures in reality? We can ask all those important questions to create those valuable feedback loops that'll feed into the next project and allow the existing project, the one that's been built, to be refined and tweaked, and just kind of do that commissioning, just finalise that seasonal commissioning. If you had a boat, you'd call it sea trials. It's that kind of thing. So that's the kind of Rosetta Stone kind of explanation there of how these different the overlay and the AIA relate to one another. And what the Passive House Overlay is doing is really building upon that. And what we did is really usefully is we asked some questions to Passive House designers and to non-Passive House designers, as I mentioned, and we really tackled sort of 5 kind of core subject areas. We asked, at what point in the RIBA plan of work do you tackle these things? Energy, comfort, summer comfort, air tightness, and thermal bridging. And what we found was, well, dare I say, it wasn't too surprising to me, but it really kind of gave us some hard facts and figures that this thing is real, that Passive House designers do stuff earlier. Okay, we get out the blocks faster. We're testing important parameters that affect the building design sooner than other people, standard design teams. And that means that we start to we're able to hone the value of a project. Really work within the budget, rather than that scenario whereby you come up with a beautiful design, you get it to the tender stage, and then it's over budget, and then you just start to rip it apart and pull everything out to get the cost down, no matter hell or high water, just so that the project can be built. Whereas instead, if you've asked all the hard questions earlier on, it's all baked in. And what we tend to find is that, some cost management processes always go on, but we're sticking within the budget a lot more readily. So we've got some diagrams in there.
I was going to say, you have great diagrams
that talk through these kind of different parameters. That we've got earlier stages. We can make very cost-effective changes, and this is not new necessarily. Boyd Poulsen in 1976 identified this. In projects, and then Skidmore, Owings and Merrill kind of picked up on that, and then started to you've got the McLeany curves and things like that, and it's the same stuff. It's just they stole the stuff from Poulsen, didn't really admit it, and then rebranded it. Is my opinion at the very least. And then we've mapped that on, and we've kind of recognised that, but we've actually evidenced it with our survey. And so you can see that the traditional way of doing things pushes a lot of the work towards the middle. If you do design and build processes in the UK, if nothing else, tend to kind of delay a lot of decision making until you're on site, and then it's just a cluster of a mess, should we say, that can develop, and that's really not where you want to be. But Passive House helps to design processes smooth that out, and it avoids us. It helps us de-risk the process.
I think people have seen this diagram, the diagram style that you're talking about, where you have time on the x-axis and cost and effect on the y-axis. And it's essentially early on in a project, you've got high influence and low expenditure with changes to the concept for the building. Yeah. Once you get into the middle part of the process where the design's baked in and you're starting to make changes, changes become low influence and high expenditure. And so what you're showing, I think what's new with this diagram is that you're graphically depicting the Passive House workflow, which is very, very early on in the process. So it gives Passive House designers a lot of leverage to make a big difference.
Yeah. It helps to explain definitely. But as I say, this is pulling on the evidence base. It's not. We're not doing this. This isn't marketing, should we say? This is kind of, we did a survey. We've got the facts. Yeah, that's what we do in the Passive House world, isn't it? We get the evidence, and it's evidence based. At least in this case, the diagram's evidence informed. I should say it's not.
Right.
But so yeah. I mean, I think that it'd be great to think that this overlay could be then kind of taken off refined in an AIA format. How we can take those key headings, and yes, because in the UK we kind of have these 8 stages. We've kind of drawn things out that little bit further, and it maybe that would help further the conversation. So therefore you can think about the delivery strategies, the quality assurance, and the procurement processes, and how they all work themselves out, and work and mesh themselves into projects in the right way. But in addition to that, we don't just it's not just about the overlay. There's also recognition that we have what we describe as a responsibility matrix. Who does what? And that's also helps to spell out what the Passive House designer is contributing, and when they're intervening and making useful comments and feedback to the design team, to the client, and the contractor, and helping to refine things. And what you find is we've also created a schedule. It's quite an in-depth schedule of things to be done, and a lot of these things are normal headings. Any architect should be able to look through that and go, I do that anyway. And that's fine. That's exactly the way that it should be. We're not saying that you're doing it different. One of the things that people love about Passive House is that it is just designing and building buildings. It's not tacking things on to gain a point for this or that and the other. It's focusing on the building and doing it properly. And so this goes on a line-by-line basis through everything in the design process, and says when you should be starting it and when we expect it to be finished. And so it really adds an awful lot of nuance, both for new buildings and for retrofit, and for small buildings and large buildings. So there's a little table in there that you actually go through and you fill in. Does this apply to my project? Yes, it does. And you can sit down with the client, with all the design team, and have those kind of conversations about, is this relevant? Internal gains, how much attention do we need to pay it? Well, we're doing a hospital and we've got a lot of complex stuff going on. We really need to hone in on that. Fine, tick the box. And then a whole host of things start to become relevant and align with that. So
yeah, I mean, I imagine many architects are, particularly ones who are newer to Passive House practice. I mean, there's a lot to absorb and to deliver with this new tool set that people are using. And so what is exciting, I think, about the work that you've done here is you're providing the information that folks would need to create a system of practice in their offices, where you can go, and it's I think we often in this community will communicate with each other about process, but there's a rigor to the way that you've done it that makes it feel kind of actionable in a different way.
Yeah. It's demystifying, really, because I think it's that one whereby inside the Passive House community, we kind of know where we're at and how we're going about things. But for people on the outside, and let's face it, Passive House is really accelerating right now. Yeah. There's a lot of interest in it. So when you've got so many an influx of new interested people, be it clients or the architects, engineers, how do we support them in their decision-making process? We can't all be kind of hidden away. And that's what the Passive House Overlay is trying to do. It's trying to lay out the processes so people can ask the right questions at the right time, get the right support, get the right advice, and deliver projects that really work. Whilst, should we say in the UK context, then being able to target the 2030 challenge and address all of those criteria as well, basically the way that I see it mapping out, as we kind of get to a bit of a constructive end, should we say, is that we're going through we start off with the why, and then kind of go through the what. We look at how, and then we sort of do a bit of testing and investigation. We refine the design. We kind of check the evidence and verify performance through the construction in terms of airtightness and commissioning of the building services. And then we do those sea trials at sort of stage 6, 7, where we're really kind of making sure you're bedding things in, making sure it's working, and then we kind of get that learning and feed forward process going on as well. So that's sort of how it all kind of keys itself in. But hopefully this has been a good conversation just to kind of wet people's whistle, let them know that it's there. And I'd be fascinated to have conversations about how, if people want to reach out and kind of get in touch via Twitter, at Mark Siddall, RIBA, or whatever, it'd be great to talk about the overlay and see how we can, how it can be applied in the States and what lessons can be learned, because I think it is a useful, valuable tool. We just need to do that Rosetta Stone thing in a bit more detail.
Yeah, no, definitely, and we can make connections if folks want to email podcast@passivehouseaccelerator.com. We can make connections with Mark, and I think it'd be really helpful to do that specific mapping to the AIA stages. And I think the expanded AIA stages, because like I say, I think most designers do have a pre-design stage in their scope of work, and probably some follow-up stages too. So I suspect that the mapping exercise would be fairly straightforward, as you've kind of outlined the how these different stages are related to one another. Fantastic, Mark. Thank you. We also, of course, will share the reports, beautifully laid out report that was produced by Mark with Passive House Trust and RIBA. We'll include that in the show notes for folks to dive into, and please reach out for next steps.
Yeah. No, I mean that's it. It's got some of the larger projects in there as well, so it helps to wet the whistle for what Passive House can be, not just what it has been in the past. So, grand,
yes,
wonderful.
Nice.
Well, super good to speak to you, Zach.
Thanks, you too, Mark. Thanks so much.
No worries. Take care.
And that was Mark Siddall giving us a great update for his fantastic work, but also in the context of that RIBA 2030 Climate Challenge, and just some other really cool stuff that's going on. I think it's worth emphasizing what the production of this document means. I mean, Mark's done great work producing it, but I'm very interested in the events that brought this into being, given that the RIBA is the Royal Institute of Architects in the UK. They are the people who kind of regulate that or look after professional architects. And for them to be promoting Passive House in all its glory is quite an achievement, and a very, very positive thing for the future. And Mark sums it up quite nicely in that RIBA has acknowledged that they like Passive House because it works, which kind of sounds a bit obvious to us, but when you pull that apart a little bit or just sit with it, it's quite significant, because of what it means is that, in contrast to a lot of other building codes, that there isn't that confidence that everything's going to work as it should for the benefit of the people inside the buildings. So to have that recognition by RIBA is definitely significant.
Absolutely, and a big shout out to Passive House Trust and all the folks who have helped over the years lay the foundation for that recognition by RIBA. It's no small task, and you're right. That's a good point. It really shows kind of the legitimacy that Passive House enjoys in the UK, and well deserved.
Yeah. One thing I couldn't, I mean, the content is fantastic. We'll put all the links. People should definitely go and have a look. There's some really good translation, as Mark has alluded to. But I mean, overall, that general process of early design concepts through to detailed drawings is pretty similar wherever you go in the world. It might just be different names for those different stages,
right,
and separated out slightly differently, but the overall thread is the same. So when you look at the diagrams in there about the level of influence that you have at various stages through the project, the general theme, I think, is international, and that is that the earlier you get Passive House people on board and Passive House concepts into the design process, the easier it is, the cheaper it is, and the more effective that input is going to be to the end result. One thing I was thinking about, which be interesting to ask Mark about later on, is I couldn't help thinking about that process in all its glory tends to still be that single house or single building, probably quite high end because there's an architect involved. Do you have a sense, Zack, of how this type of work translates to more mass market type of design and building?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, right, because it also applies to multifamily buildings where architects are involved. So I mean, this concept, and we know that FIAS has rolled out. I mean, it's been out now for a little while. The prescriptive path to a passive house, which is one of the key purposes of that is to allow passive house to scale among like production builders and just to make it easier and not less onerous to do. It doesn't require the kind of energy modeling and all that stuff. It's more here, if you follow these steps and hit these marks for R value and the various metrics in your components, that you're gonna get there. So in some ways, I think the philosophy is the same, because it's essentially taking all of that planning that is required early on in a traditional architect involved project and FIAS taking that on in its design of the prescriptive standard, right? So there's I think there's a through line in that way, that there's this that there is this opportunity with passive house building to make a big difference in a cost-effective way if you plan ahead. And
I would like to see more guides and resources like this and just general practice in whatever method of producing homes is being undertaken. And if I'm thinking about like a large developer here or a group home builder, volume builder, there might still be an architect somewhere. It might be at the early concept stage, and this can still take place. And if it means that it's a repeated design or there's a plan book that ultimately gets a few tweaks once customers start looking at homes, a lot of this thinking can still be put into that very early stage. So I'd like to think this work is definitely transferable to the whole industry, and not just the sort of higher end who's engaging an architect and building one-off bespoke houses, because it's definitely very valuable. And looking through the actual document, which is freely available, so anyone can go head over. We'll put the links in there, but architecture.com is where you can find all the RIBA resources. It's very easy to see that it is quite high level, which I think is really useful as well, because it's quite conceptual. It's basically saying get the passive house people on board in the team really early on in the process. One of the things I'd like to pull out from the detail is around commissioning, and something that Mark talked about was occupant surveys, post-occupancy surveys, and that the project isn't finished when you hand the keys over and you've got the final consent or whatever it is in the particular jurisdiction. it goes beyond that. You have to, as I like that concept that he said of sea trials. You need to test things out. You need to check that everything's working properly. And he also alluded briefly to seasonal commissioning, and I think that's a really important concept as well, because if you hand over the keys in the middle of winter, then what the occupants of that building need to do in 6 months' time might be quite different. And I think that is often lost. People can just get the home and it's all on them and off you go. But buildings, they change with the seasons.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I thought that was an interesting kind of realization that we had when he was doing the translation between the RIBA stages and the stages that are outlined by AIA. I mean, the AIA stages are schematic design development, construction, or CDs, construction documents, bidding, and construction administration, right? Those are the 5. Those are essentially, I think, steps 2 through 6 on the RIBA, and more or less on the RIBA stages. RIBA also has that first stage, which is, I don't have it in front of me, but it's basically the pre-design. And then it has 2 more stages at the very end that have to do with, actually running the building. And so I think it's
so they got schematic definition, strategic definition, at the outset,
right?
And then right at the end is handover, and then beyond handover is use.
Right, and so the RIBA already is kind of more formalize those the head and the tail. I think is the way that Mark mentioned, was referring to it, of the process, which I think is helpful. And practitioners definitely in the U.S. usually will be outlining those stage, some form of those stages in their scope. But I think it's really handy that RIBA has already had that set up, and so then the Passive House Overlay can really fit onto that and really deal with the early planning stages and also the monitoring stages later in the commissioning.
Yeah. And just finally, the other thing that for me that stood out is Mark alluding to the reality of delaying decisions to the building site. And I know that happens more often than it should here. A little bit surprising to hear in some ways that it happens in the UK as well. But I know that there's that tendency to basically let the builder figure things out on site, and that is just asking for disaster. I think I can see that it happens because it works if all you're interested in doing is getting compliance and getting the job finished. It's like, well, let the builder deal with it. They'll put in more timber probably than they need to and just make it work, and you'll end up with a massive thermal bridge, as one example. So figuring those things out early on and not letting things get to the building site without having every detail absolutely figured out, I think is crucial. It means you have to do a little bit more thinking up front. Right.
But yeah, so totally mission critical on a Passive House project. You can't, you can't just wing it.
Yeah. Awesome stuff. Really great to have Mark back on the show, and great to have Mark in the community producing such great resources. And I know this document has already been shared and referred to quite a lot. So it's also really encouraging, as I said at the top, that influential organizations like RIBA are effectively embracing Passive House in this way and encouraging the use of it, and for the purpose of getting better designs for everyone. So awesome stuff. Thank you for organizing that, Zack.
Oh, my pleasure. It was fun.
Yeah. So what have we got coming up?
So this week on Passive House Accelerator Live, it'll be the first Wednesday of the month. New Zealand and Australia, it'll be the first Thursday when this happens. We're doing our Passive House Accelerator Live 101 episode, and it's going to be with Tessa Bradley of Artisans Group, and she's a fantastic presenter. She's going to be presenting 10 steps to designing a single-family passive house. tips and tricks from an architect. So this is we've got something of a theme happening here with the 10 steps that Michael Ingui kicked that off a couple months ago when he was talking about passive house design in kind of in general. And now Tessa's going to focus in on single family passive house, and there's some really great ones. So I just saw the run through a couple days ago. It's going to be fantastic. And then next week for the next gen series of Passive House Accelerator Live, that'll be happening on April 12th here in the US, April 13th for you down under. We're going to be joined by Vicky Yee of Stephen Winter Associates, and she's going to be presenting about this exciting technology that's becoming, that's really emerging, the future of package terminal heat pumps and passive house. So PTHPs is what is the acronym. People may be familiar with PTAC units. Certainly in North America, we have these horrible, noisy, ineffective, crappy HVAC units that are in many motel rooms. So this is this is taking everything up in many levels, and makes it's easily applied in many different scenarios, and it brings heat pump technology to units that otherwise might be difficult to do that with. So Vicky's going to dive into the details about that, and it's going to be a great technical conversation. Also, THEUSCon is their abstracts open, right, on THEUSCon?
That's right. Announced this week. So that's coming up in October, I think October or November, the conference, but abstracts are now open. Looking forward to that one because it's in Texas, and it's
in Houston. Yes,
Houston, yeah, which is awesome because it's really taking passive house to those warmer climates, except for when it snows, of course, in Texas. But
right.
when it's not, it is a warmer climate, and I know that there's a lot of thinking being going on in all flavors of passive house as to how best to deal with warm and humid climates.
Yeah. And the conference is I just looked it up to remind myself, it's November 9th and November 10th, Thursday and Friday, with pre-conference on Tuesday and Wednesday of that week.
Yeah. So get your abstracts in.
Indeed.
All right. Hey, thank you very much, Zack. We'll be back again next week with another episode. Until then, I hope everything is well. And we'll see you again next week on the Passive House Podcast.